Swedish king is probably the most prominent man on the Protestant side, and he has a huge number of successful battles coming from the Baltic Sea all the way to Munich in the southern part of what is Germany today. But he's then killed on the battlefield after only 2 years. And then there's another last war stage as well, the Swedish-French War during the last 13 years. And that also shows you that the religious motivations get more and more into the background at this point, because when the Swedish and the French are forming an alliance against the Catholic Emperor, that is basically consisting of the Protestant side and the French side, which is actually a Catholic nation. So these two are in an alliance against the Emperor, which means religion alone is by far not the decisive factor at this point anymore. So if you look at the map once again, we can see these different stages here too. So everything starts in Bohemia, in the region around Prague. Afterwards, the troops of the Bavarian Duke go to the Palatinate on the Rhine River, basically. Then you have the Danish king interfering from the north. So you have the Swedish coming over the Baltic Sea, landing here at the coastline and going down all the way to Munich. And then we have the alliance of the French and the Swedish for the last 13 years of the war. So why is this conflict up until today often called the German trauma, and especially before it was kind of overwritten in collective memory at the beginning of the 20th century with World War I and especially World War II? One of the reasons is the length, of course. Another reason is that almost all the fighting happened on German-speaking territory. And if you look at a map that shows us the various battles, that is not really the most important thing here. If you look at the colors, the darker the color is, the larger is the loss of population at the end of the 30 Years' War. And you can see the darkest red color means that about 50% of the people are dying in these areas, and especially in a corridor that is going from the southwest of what is Germany today to the northeast. You have a huge loss in population, and of course also a very high number of atrocities. However, many people, of course, are not killed directly. Often it is malnutrition, diseases that follow the battles, which demand a lot of victims in the long run. What does it look like on the battlefield in that period? Well, you can see the typical weapons of the time. I mentioned the pikes already, which are really very high. You have, of course, also those people here with the guns, the regular infantry, which can actually shoot only once, and then they have to load the gun again, which takes roughly 5 minutes at this time. So that really makes it very difficult to use that in an active way. The nobility was mostly, of course, sitting on horseback. So the cavalry, that was the wealthier people. They also have 2 pistols here, and they can also shoot only once, and then they have to return to the background of the battlefield, load, and come back again. And these cannons are also very important during this time, although we have to say they were not very flexible. They were very heavy, so whenever it was muddy, soon they were sinking in. You often couldn't move them very well, and they were also very expensive. Shooting one cannonball was basically as expensive as paying a foot soldier for entire months. So that shows you you had to think twice before you were using these weapons, and very often avoiding battle was the more successful tactics compared to trying to win over the other side directly. In the War Museum in Vienna, which you might be able to visit on this trip, we can see one display of uniforms that people were wearing in the 30 Years' War, although we have to say these are really the very tidy, clean versions. In the long run, a lot of these soldiers were in a very desperate economic situation themselves. They were not really doing much better than the farmers or the peasants that they were raiding in the villages in many cases. One of the difficulties for the soldiers was the fact that there were no standing armies in the period that we are talking about, but rather most armies were financed in a private way by warlords which were very common in this period. The most famous and successful warlord of the 30 Years' War was a man called Albrecht von Wallenstein, who offered his services to the Catholic Emperor, and he provided a huge army, at one point 100,000 people, and he introduced a system that was called contributions, which was basically a tax that all the areas had to pay where this army was stationed, no matter if they were friends or enemies. And this system worked very well. It was copied by other similar warlords in later years too. The problem was, however, that only under Wallenstein's control a rather severe discipline was obeyed and pushed through by the leaders. Later on, warlords that followed Wallenstein could not maintain that in a similar way. That is why so many atrocities affected the civil population, and this is why you often see pictures or prints like this from the 30 Years' War. That's a very famous one, the hanging tree, which actually shows soldiers that are punished in front of others to show that you should obey the orders that the military leaders were given. Yeah, like I said, the battles were actually rather rare. What happened quite often was that cities were put under siege, like Magdeburg in the northeastern part of Germany in May 1631. It was defended by Protestant troops, put under siege by the Catholics, and then also conquered after a couple of weeks. And looting the houses of a city that was conquered was basically part of the payment that the soldiers received, and that is one of the reasons why so many atrocities were committed. And in the case of Magdeburg, it escalated a lot, and the entire city was burned down. And it was a very wealthy city originally, with roughly 40,000 people, as many as Hamburg at this time. But after the fire, after the conquest, following the siege, Magdeburg had only about 2,000 people left. Most had been killed, the others had escaped, and the city should never really play a very important role anymore. We know a lot about the details of the warfare in the 30 Years' War from some diaries that were found of some of these mercenaries that fought in the war. A very famous one is that of Peter Hagendorf, a soldier who served in the Imperial Army for more than 20 years, and his diary was found in the library in Berlin only about 30 years ago. And in more than 170 pages, he describes what the life of such a mercenary is like. And what is very interesting, for example, is to see that, of course, the army did not only consist of the soldiers themselves. They also had a huge so-called baggage following the army, a large number of wagons, including supplies, but also merchants, and a lot of women and even children were following the army wherever they went. And in the case of Peter Hagendorf, we know that he was married for most of the time that he actually fought in the war. He had 8 children together with his wife, but only 2 of them grew to an older age, which shows you about the hygienic situations, for example, of course, at this time in the army there. We also know from Peter Hagendorf's notes that especially after 1635 the situation was escalating in the war at a time when many people didn't even know what they were fighting for anymore. That was the time when pamphlets were printed that showed the beast of war that is entirely out of control, and these are the times when a lot of paintings are made like those that we know from the 30 Years' War, when villages were often raided 10, 20 times in a couple of years, and many of the peasants didn't even know if the troops had been the Catholic or the Protestant ones, because they all behaved in a very similar way. Like I mentioned, most of the people who died often died because the crops were destroyed, because the soldiers had brought diseases to the areas in which they came. And now in the last part of my talk, like I said, I want to look at some of the places that you are visiting on this trip to see how they had been affected by the 30 Years' War. The first place I want to look at is Heidelberg, that many of you have seen on this trip already. And like I said, that was the home territory of the Winter King Frederick V, who had accepted the crown of Bohemia, but who had been then had been escaping to the Netherlands after the Catholic victory in Prague, and the Duke of Bavaria then tried to take what was left of the belongings of Frederick V in Heidelberg. So you can see the city was put under siege. This is the Neckar River here. The artillery of the Bavarians and also of some Spanish soldiers that are also fighting on the Catholic side is trying to